My own daughter looked me in the eye, her voice steady, her expression cold. Either serve my husband, or leave my home. The words didn't come from a stranger. They didn't come from a neighbor, an enemy, or even a passing acquaintance. They came from the very child I carried in my womb, the baby I raised with my own hands, the girl I once protected from the cruelties of the world. In that moment, time stopped. My hands trembled as I reached for my suitcase. The sound of the zipper echoed louder than her voice, louder than the pounding of my heart. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I simply walked out. The slam of the front door behind me wasn't just wood meeting metal. It was the sound of a bond shattering, a chapter closing, a family unraveling. But what none of them realized, not my daughter, not her husband, was that this quiet walkaway would set off a chain of events none of us could escape. Because exactly 1 week later, I sat in a borrowed room, staring down at my phone. The screen lit up with a number I knew by heart. 37 missed calls. 37 silent pleas. 37 unanswered reminders that even blood ties can be broken, and that sometimes, regret doesn't come until it's far too late. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has reached, because no mother should ever feel this kind of heartbreak alone. This is not just a story about a mother and daughter. It's about loyalty, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to walk away from those who should stand by you the most. And to understand how we got here, how a single ultimatum turned love into distance, and distance into silence, we need to go back to where the cracks first began. I never imagined my life would reach this point. I wasn't raised to expect comfort, but I also wasn't prepared for betrayal to come from inside my own home. My name isn't important right now, it could be any mother's name, in any town across America. What matters is that for years I gave everything I had to one person, my daughter. She was my reason to keep moving, the one light I held onto after my husband passed away. When the world seemed too heavy, her laughter reminded me why I kept fighting. We weren't rich, not even close. I worked 2 jobs most of her childhood, waitressing during the day, cleaning offices at night. I stitched her Halloween costumes by hand, saved pennies in jars to buy her birthday cakes, and told her bedtime stories until she fell asleep on my shoulder. I was her safe place, her anchor, her everything. That bond was my proudest accomplishment. But bonds can change in ways you don't notice right away. It starts small like a hairline crack in glass. You don't see it at first, not until the whole surface begins to splinter. The first time I sensed something shifting, she had just started dating him. I'll never forget that dinner. We sat at the table, just the 3 of us. I made pot roast, her favorite, the way she used to beg for as a little girl. But instead of laughing with me, she leaned in toward him, her eyes following his every word. I tried to join the conversation, but somehow my voice didn't fit. He spoke over me, answered questions I hadn't finished asking, corrected details from stories he wasn't even part of. She smiled at him, laughed at his interruptions. And I sat there, quietly, realizing I was no longer at the center of her world. At first, I told myself it was love. Young people get swept up. It's natural. I'd been there once too. But this was different. This wasn't just infatuation. It was as if he was already claiming authority, marking territory. When he disagreed with me, she sided with him. When I gave advice, she dismissed it, brushing me off as though I was outdated, irrelevant. I remember one evening, she came into the kitchen while I was drying the dishes. I told her I was worried she was rushing too quickly, that maybe she should slow down, finish her degree before committing to marriage. She put her hand on my shoulder, and instead of warmth, there was distance in her eyes. "Mom, times are different now. You wouldn't understand." That sentence cut deeper than she realized. I had lived through struggles she couldn't begin to imagine. Yet she acted as though my experience was nothing more than a relic. Her husband, though, he seemed to thrive on that divide. He was polite in public, respectful when others were watching, but inside the walls of our home, his words carried weight that pushed me aside. At family gatherings, he redirected conversations, always steering them back to himself. If I made a suggestion, he smirked or chuckled as if I were out of touch. And each time, I looked to my daughter, hoping she would step in, defend me the way I once defended her as a child. But she didn't. She sat quietly, sometimes even laughing along. I told myself it was just adjustment. Every household has growing pains. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was just too sensitive, still grieving the absence of my husband, and the life we once shared. But late at night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being slowly erased, piece by piece. It wasn't just in conversations. Small things added up. They'd plan outings without telling me. I'd overhear them whispering in the living room, voices dropping when I entered. My cooking, once her comfort, became something they criticized. Too heavy, he'd say. Not healthy enough. And she'd nod, forgetting the nights I stretched rice and beans into meals that kept her full when we had nothing else. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself she was just caught in the rush of a new marriage, that maybe he didn't mean harm, maybe I was imagining motives that weren't there. But a mother knows. A mother feels when she's no longer welcome. One night, as I folded laundry, I heard their voices rising from the living room. I froze in the hallway holding a towel to my chest, listening. He was complaining that I was still living with them, that my presence made him uncomfortable. And then I heard my daughter's reply, quiet, hesitant but clear enough. I know. I'll talk to her. I leaned against the wall, the towel slipping from my hands. That was the first time I realized the shift wasn't just temporary. It wasn't something that would balance out with time. Something permanent was taking shape, something that would force me to choose between holding on and letting go. And I was beginning to understand that choice might not be mine to make. The first signs weren't loud and they weren't dramatic. They crept in quietly, almost unnoticed, like shadows lengthening across a wall at dusk. It began with small gestures, the kind of things most people might dismiss if they weren't paying attention. But I noticed them. Mothers always do. At the dinner table, he would sit back in his chair, eyes fixed on me, and instead of asking politely, he would instruct. Pass the salt. Not please. Not would you mind, but an order. When I handed it over, he wouldn't even look up, wouldn't acknowledge me with a thank you. My daughter would smile, brush off the silence, and continue eating as though this was normal. I told myself it was just his way. Some men are raised differently, I thought. But deep inside, I knew the difference between habits and disregard. Soon it wasn't just about condiments or side dishes. He began leaving his empty plate pushed toward me at the end of the meal, as though I were a servant waiting to clear it. At first, I hesitated, hoping my daughter would notice and step in. Instead, she laughed lightly, almost nervously, and picked up her plate while leaving his untouched. The message was clear. This was my role now, whether I agreed or not. One evening, I cooked a full dinner after working all day around the house. I set the table carefully, just as I always had, wanting to create something warm. When we sat down, he took a bite, frowned, and set his fork down with a clink that echoed too loud in my ears. Too salty, he said flatly. My daughter glanced at him, then at me, and instead of defending me, she chuckled and said, "Mom, you always use too much salt." My chest tightened at those words. She knew how many times I skipped meals so she could eat. She knew how much love I folded into every dish I prepared. But in that moment, she chose his approval over my dignity. After that, I noticed the pattern. His requests grew sharper, his tone firmer. He asked for water without moving from his seat. He expected coffee in the mornings, hot and waiting before he left for work. The first few times, I did it quietly, almost instinctively, as I had once done for my husband out of love. But this was different. There was no tenderness in his eyes, no gratitude in his voice. Only expectation, like it was a duty I had signed up for without realizing it. What hurt most wasn't his demands. It was her silence. My daughter, who once curled up beside me on cold nights and whispered that she never wanted to grow up because she always wanted to stay close to me, now sat beside him and watched me carry plates, fetch drinks, and clear tables without a word. Sometimes she even laughed when he made jokes at my expense. "Mom's old-fashioned," she'd say, as though I were some relic to be tolerated, not a mother to be respected. One Sunday afternoon, we had company over, friends from their circle. I was setting out glasses when one of them asked if I'd be joining them at the table. Before I could answer, her husband chuckled and said, "She prefers keeping busy." "Right, Mom." The room erupted in polite laughter. My daughter smiled, not once glancing at the discomfort etched on my face. I stood there, frozen, glass in hand, feeling like a shadow in a home I once thought was mine. That night, lying awake, I asked myself a question that cut deeper than any insult could. When did I stop being her mother and become her maid? The answer didn't come, but the silence was louder than any response I could imagine. I tried to justify it, telling myself she was under his influence, that love sometimes blinds us to the way we treat those closest to us. I reminded myself of the years we shared, the bond that surely couldn't disappear overnight. But every day, it became harder to recognize the girl I raised. She had once defended me fiercely against kids who teased me for working late hours, proud of how hard I worked to keep us afloat. Now, she looked at me as though I were an obligation, a burden to be managed. I began to retreat into myself, moving more quietly around the house, avoiding conversations, trying not to be in the way. I thought that maybe if I didn't push, if I stayed small enough, the tension would ease. But it didn't. It only grew. His words sharpened, her laughter followed, and I was left with the bitter realization that love alone wasn't enough to protect me from being diminished in my own daughter's eyes. It was the kind of heartbreak you can't explain to anyone else. Friends might say, she'll come around. Or that's just how newlyweds are. But they didn't hear the way he called out my name like a command. They didn't see the way she smiled at him afterward, as though my silence was the punchline of their private joke. They didn't feel the hollow weight in my chest when I realized that my presence, once her comfort, had become her inconvenience. I kept asking myself, how did we get here? How did the girl I gave my life for become a woman who allowed me to be treated as less than human under her roof? The answers wouldn't come, but the questions grew heavier with each passing day. And deep down, I knew these were only the first signs of something that would cut even deeper than I could imagine. It was a Saturday evening when the moment came that would leave a scar I could never erase. My daughter had invited a few friends over, couples from her husband's workplace and neighbors she wanted to impress. The house was filled with voices, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. I spent the day preparing food, setting the table, and making sure everything looked welcoming. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I showed her friends the warmth I always gave her, she would remember who I was. Perhaps she would see me as her mother again, not as the woman who lingered in the background. When the guests arrived, her husband immediately took center stage, greeting everyone with a booming voice and a confident grin. My daughter followed close behind, her smile fixed, her arm looped through his as though she were an extension of him rather than her own person. I moved quietly through the room, making sure everyone had what they needed, refilling drinks, and collecting empty plates. At first, I thought I could stay invisible, that I could just help from the corners and let them have their evening. But midway through the night, as I walked by carrying a tray of appetizers, one of the guests turned to me and asked warmly, "Are you her mother? You must be so proud." For a brief second, I felt a flicker of relief. Someone had seen me, not as a maid, not as a shadow, but as a mother. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, her husband cut in. He laughed loudly, placed his hand on my daughter's shoulder, and said, "Oh, don't mind her. She likes keeping busy. It keeps her from getting bored, right, Mom?" The room filled with chuckles, polite but sharp in my ears. I froze, still holding the tray, my face burning. My daughter glanced at him, then at me, and instead of correcting him, instead of saying, "This is my mother, the woman who raised me," she laughed too. The sound pierced through me like glass. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't embarrassed laughter. It was agreement. I stood there, my body rigid, trying to smile through the ache in my chest. But inside something cracked wide open. I had been reduced in front of strangers, treated as though my worth existed only in what I could carry, clean, or serve. And my own daughter, the child who once clung to me when she was scared of the dark, was part of it. When the guests finally left and the house grew quiet, I retreated to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap, my heart heavy. I didn't make a sound at first, but then the tears came, spilling silently down my cheeks. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle the sobs, terrified they would hear. It wasn't just sadness, it was shame, a shame I shouldn't have felt but couldn't push away. I cried for the little girl I raised, for the bond that seemed to dissolve before my eyes, for the home that no longer felt like mine. As I wiped my face and stared at the darkened ceiling, I wondered how much further it could go. Would she ever stand up for me again? Would she ever see me for who I was instead of the role I had been forced into? My mind told me to confront her, to demand answers, but my heart was too fragile, too broken from the sting of public humiliation. What I didn't know that night was that the decision was already taking shape in her mind. The words had not yet been spoken, but they were forming, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. My daughter, the girl I once carried in my arms, was preparing to give me an ultimatum that would cut deeper than anything I had felt before. I didn't know it then, but the laughter in that living room was only the beginning. The real wound was still waiting, and it would come not in front of strangers, but face to face, with no audience except the two of us. And when it came, it would force me to choose between staying in a house that no longer held space for me, or walking away from the very child I had given my life to raise. That night, I cried until sleep finally claimed me, and while I slept somewhere in her heart, she was already deciding which place I would hold in her life. Servant, or nothing at all. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind of evening that should have been ordinary. The air was still, the house calm, the faint smell of dinner still lingering in the kitchen. I had cleared the table, washed the dishes, and was drying my hands when I heard her footsteps approaching. My daughter entered the room, her face unreadable, Her shoulders squared in a way that reminded me of moments from her childhood when she tried to stand tall in the face of things that frightened her. But this was not fear. This was decision. She leaned against the counter for a moment, her eyes fixed on me, and I felt something shift in the air, heavy and cold. When she finally spoke, her words carried no hesitation, no tremor, no softness. Mom, you're either going to respect my marriage and serve my husband, or you can leave my house. The words fell between us like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I knew. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My ears rang, as though I had been struck. I looked at her, waiting for some sign that she was joking, exaggerating, testing me. But her face remained hard, her jaw set. There was no humor, no doubt. She meant every syllable. My chest tightened, a sharp ache pressing against my ribs. Serve her husband? I replayed the phrase in my mind, as though I had misheard it. But there was no mistake. My own daughter, the child I had cradled, the young woman whose tears I had wiped away, whose victories I had celebrated, had reduced me to this. Someone to fetch and carry, someone to cater and obey. Inside, my thoughts raced. Memories of her as a little girl flashed before me, the way she once held my hand too tightly on her first day of school, the way she whispered that she never wanted me to grow old, because she couldn't imagine a world without me. I thought of the nights I worked late, my body aching, just to keep a roof over our heads. I thought of the times I went without so she could have new shoes, new books, a better chance than I ever did. And now here she stood, telling me my place was no longer as her mother, but as a servant to the man she married. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to remind her of all that had been given, all that had been sacrificed. But my lips would not move. The silence between us grew heavier, stretching out, filling the room until it seemed the walls themselves were closing in. She waited, her eyes hard, as though daring me to challenge her. In that silence I felt something inside me fracture. It wasn't anger at first, it was disbelief, raw and piercing. My mind fought against the words she had spoken, unwilling to accept them as real. How could she say this? How could she believe it? How could the bond between mother and child unravel so completely that respect was no longer offered but demanded in service to someone else? Her husband's shadow loomed over her even when he wasn't in the room. His influence clung to her words, to the way she held herself, to the coldness in her tone. But still she had chosen to speak them. She had chosen his comfort over my dignity. And that knowledge cut deeper than any insult he had ever thrown my way. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my hands trembling at my sides. I wanted to scream, to ask her how she could forget the woman who gave her life, the mother who never abandoned her. But no sound came. The silence was louder than any argument could have been. In that heavy pause I realized something else. My choice was already made for me. Because if I stayed, I would be acknowledging her words as truth, accepting a place that stripped me of every ounce of self-respect. And if I left, I would be walking away from the very person I had built my life around. Either way, the loss was unbearable. She shifted slightly, her arms folding across her chest, her eyes locked on mine. She was waiting for an answer, a submission, an agreement to her terms. But my voice refused to obey. All I could do was stand there, frozen, my heart breaking, my mind replaying the question I never thought I would have to ask. Who was this woman standing before me? My daughter? Or a stranger wearing her face? The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second marking the distance growing between us. I felt the weight of years pressing down, the memories of love and sacrifice crashing against the sharpness of her ultimatum. I searched her face for the girl I once knew, the daughter who once loved me without condition. But she was gone, replaced by someone who saw me not as family, but as an obstacle to be managed, a servant to be commanded. And in that suffocating silence, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I stood in that kitchen long after my daughter had left the room, her words echoing inside me like a bell that refused to stop ringing. My feet felt rooted to the ground, but my spirit had already begun to rise above the space I no longer belonged to. There was no need to argue, no need to plead. Some battles aren't fought with raised voices. They are fought with silence, with the quiet decision to reclaim your dignity even if it means losing everything else. I walked slowly to the small room where I had been staying. The walls felt colder now, as if they knew what was about to happen. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, my hands resting on my knees, my heart pounding in my chest. I had two choices: stay and shrink myself into the role she and her husband demanded of me, or leave and carry the weight of this heartbreak into an uncertain tomorrow. The choice was agony, but in truth it was no choice at all. I reached for the suitcase tucked beneath the bed. It had been years since I last used it, but now it slid out easily as though it too had been waiting for this moment. I opened it carefully and began to fold my clothes, one blouse, one dress, one pair of shoes at a time. Every garment carried a memory. Birthdays celebrated, holidays shared, moments of joy when love still felt safe and unconditional. Folding them now was like closing the pages of a book I never thought I'd finish. There were no tears. Not this time. I had cried in silence too many nights already. Tonight there was only resolve. My hands moved steadily, my breath slow and measured. Each item I packed was not just fabric. It was a reminder of who I was before disappointment had carved its lines into me. And as I placed them carefully into the suitcase, I whispered to myself, if my love is conditional, then it is no love at all. Her words had drawn a line in the sand. To cross it would mean surrendering my worth. So instead, I chose to step back, to carry myself across a threshold she thought she controlled. But a mother is more than her child's approval. A woman is more than the service demanded of her. And I would not let them strip me of that truth. The zipper closed with a sound that felt final, like the sealing of a chapter. I stood up, the weight of the suitcase grounding me, but also strengthening me. I didn't slam doors or storm out in rage. My departure was not about spectacle. It was about strength. Quiet, steady strength. I paused in the hallway, my eyes falling on the family pictures hanging on the wall. My daughter's smile as a little girl stared back at me, innocent and trusting. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if she would ever remember that version of herself, the one who loved without conditions. I reached out and brushed my fingers against the frame, not to take it with me, but to say goodbye to the life that once was. At the doorway, I hesitated. The night outside was still, the sky heavy with clouds. My hand tightened around the handle of the suitcase. I didn't know where I was going, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. But even in that uncertainty, there was freedom. Because whatever lay ahead could not possibly be worse than staying in a place where my worth had been reduced to servitude. I stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind me. There was no goodbye, no final look back. Some endings don't need words, they only need action. The cool night air hit my face, carrying with it both sorrow and release. I walked down the path, each step measured, steady, unshaken. And as the house grew smaller behind me, I realized something profound. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not in anger, but in walking away with your dignity intact. But as the darkness of the night swallowed me, a question lingered heavy in my chest. Where would I go now? Who, if anyone, would open their door to me? And that's when I felt it, the weight of the unknown pressing in. My journey had only just begun. I walked into the night with no clear destination, only the weight of my suitcase and the ache of what I had just left behind. My steps carried me down familiar streets, past houses lit warmly from within, where families laughed and shared their evenings together. I wondered if anyone looking out their window could see the heaviness I carried, or if to them I was just another passerby, a shadow slipping quietly into the darkness. At first I thought of booking a room somewhere, but the idea of waking up alone in a place that had no memory of me made my chest tighten. Then, almost without thinking, I turned toward the home of a woman who had stood by me through the years. Her name was Margaret, an old friend from church. We had sung together in the choir, shared meals on Sundays, and carried one another through more than one storm. I hadn't told her much about the struggles in my daughter's home, only bits and pieces, because admitting the truth felt like admitting defeat. But tonight I had no choice. Her porch light was on when I arrived. I hesitated before knocking, worried I might be intruding, worried she might see the shame I carried. But the moment the door opened and she saw me standing there, suitcase in hand, her face softened in a way that nearly broke me. She didn't ask for explanations, didn't press me with questions. Instead, she simply stepped aside and said, "Come in, you're home here." Those words undid me. I hadn't realized how starved I was for kindness until that moment. I walked inside, and the warmth of her house wrapped around me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. The faint smell of fresh bread lingered in the air, and her living room glowed softly with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. She took my suitcase without a word and led me to the guest room. "Rest first," she said. "We'll talk when you're ready." That night, lying on a bed that was not mine but felt more like home than the one I had left, I exhaled fully for the first time in years. The silence was no longer heavy, it was healing. I didn't have to listen for footsteps, didn't have to measure my every word, didn't have to shrink myself so someone else could feel taller. I could simply exist, and that was enough. In the days that followed, Margaret's presence was a balm to my wounded spirit. She didn't pry, but she listened when I finally found the courage to speak. I told her about the coldness that had crept into my daughter's house, the subtle ways her husband had stripped me of dignity, the final blow of being given an ultimatum no mother should ever hear. She nodded gently, her eyes kind but firm, and when I finished she placed her hand over mine and said, "You don't deserve that. No one does." You're more than what they tried to make you. Her words planted something in me that had been missing for a long time. Strength. Real strength. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. In her home I was not invisible. I was not unwanted. I was simply myself, and that was enough. There were moments when guilt tried to creep in, whispering that maybe I should have stayed, that maybe I owed my daughter more patience, more sacrifice. But each time, I reminded myself, love that demands you bow to indignity is not love at all. And the contrast between Margaret's gentle welcome and my daughter's harsh rejection made that truth clearer than ever. For the first time in years, I could breathe without walking on eggshells. I could sip my coffee without someone's disapproving glance. I could laugh without fear of it being mocked. And in that freedom, I realized just how heavy the chains had been before I broke them. Still, even in the safety of my friend's home, a question tugged at me. What would come next? Where would this path lead me? Because as much as Margaret's kindness sheltered me, I knew I could not stay hidden forever. My story was not finished, it was only beginning. And somewhere out there, consequences were waiting to unfold. In the quiet of Margaret's home, I began to feel pieces of myself returning, pieces I hadn't realized I had lost. At first, the silence unsettled me. I had grown so used to tiptoeing around sharp words and judgmental glances that peace felt unfamiliar, almost foreign. But as the days unfolded, I found myself remembering who I had been before I allowed my world to shrink to fit someone else's expectations. Each morning I would wake up early and sit by the window, a steaming cup of coffee warming my hands. The sunrise painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to watch it without rushing, without worrying about whether I was moving quickly enough to avoid criticism. It was in those quiet mornings that my mind drifted back to the sacrifices I had made for my daughter. I remembered working 2 jobs when she was a teenager, my body exhausted but my spirit determined, just so she could have new clothes for prom, just so she wouldn't feel the sting of being left out. I remembered skipping meals so I could stretch the groceries a little longer, telling her I wasn't hungry when really my stomach was aching. I remembered sitting up with her at night through sickness, through heartbreak, through fear, whispering that she was never alone. Every decision I made, every ounce of energy I poured out, had been to build her a life with more comfort, more choice, more freedom than I ever had. And now, here I was, reclaiming the fragments of the woman who had been buried under years of sacrifice. Margaret would sometimes join me at the table with her own coffee, and we would laugh over small things, an old story from church, a memory of our children when they were little, even a silly show on TV. That laughter was medicine. It reminded me that joy could exist without strings attached, without walking on eggshells. One afternoon, I wandered into her kitchen and found myself cooking. Not out of obligation, not because anyone expected it of me, but because I wanted to. I chopped onions, stirred pots, seasoned dishes the way my mother once taught me. The aromas filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, I tasted my own food without wondering if someone would complain. That simple act of cooking for myself, not for approval, not for duty, felt like rediscovering an old friend. Margaret noticed the difference in me. She would smile softly when she saw me humming under my breath, or when she caught me jotting down thoughts in the small journal she had placed on the nightstand. Writing became my quiet refuge. I poured my heart into those pages, the pain of rejection, the memories of sacrifice, the fragile hope that perhaps in rebuilding myself, I might finally step into the life I deserved. The words flowed freely, unfiltered, and as I filled each page, I felt the weight on my chest lift a little more. Sometimes at night, I would lie in bed and replay the scene of my daughter's ultimatum. The sting was still there, sharp and undeniable. But alongside that pain was a growing sense of clarity. I could not change her choices, nor could I control the man she chose to honor above her mother. But I could choose myself. I could choose dignity, peace, and self-respect over a house where love came with conditions. The healing came in small, unexpected ways. The freedom to take a long walk without glancing over my shoulder. The quiet pleasure of reading a book uninterrupted. The comfort of knowing that the roof over my head belonged to someone who welcomed me, not tolerated me. Each moment was a reminder that I was still whole, still worthy, still alive. Slowly, I began to see my reflection differently. I was not just a mother who had been cast aside. I was a woman with resilience carved into her bones. I was a friend who could still give and receive love freely. I was a person with value, even when my own flesh and blood tried to deny it. And in that rediscovery, something unexpected stirred within me. Strength, not the kind that comes from fighting loudly, but the kind that grows quietly in the aftermath of heartbreak. A strength that whispers, you survived, and now you will live. The days in Margaret's home stretched into weeks, and with each passing morning I felt stronger, more anchored in myself. I hadn't gone looking for news of my daughter. My heart was still too raw, but whispers have a way of finding you, even when you least expect them. It started one afternoon when I went to the corner store for a few groceries. A woman who used to be our neighbor recognized me. She hesitated at first, then leaned closer, lowering her voice the way people do when they think they're sharing something too juicy to hold in. "Are you staying with Margaret now?" she asked. I nodded, uncertain of what to say. She gave me a sympathetic look, her lips tightening. "I don't know the details, but things aren't going well over there." I didn't press her, but as I walked home with my bag of bread and milk, her words clung to me like a burr. That evening, as the sun set, Margaret mentioned she had heard similar talk from another church member. Apparently, shouting matches had become common in my daughter's home. Neighbors said the voices carried through the walls, arguments sharp and bitter, no longer hidden behind polite smiles. It was hard to picture my daughter, who had once turned her back on me in the name of protecting her marriage, now locked in battles with the man she defended so fiercely. But perhaps it wasn't so hard after all. The arrogance, the cold authority he had shown me, was now turned inward, aimed at her. Soon more details reached me in fragments. Bills were stacking up. The husband, who always liked to boast about his control, had made reckless financial choices. Their lights had been cut off once, and the car payment was months behind. A friend whispered that my daughter had borrowed money in secret, though her pride kept her from admitting it openly. Then came the rumor that twisted the knife deeper. He might be cheating. Nothing proven, only suspicions, but enough to stir tension in their home. Late nights unaccounted for. Phone calls answered in another room. Perfume on his clothes that wasn't hers. My daughter, once so quick to dismiss my concerns, was now choking on the very betrayal she refused to see. I lay awake some nights, staring at the ceiling in Margaret's guest room, my mind heavy with the irony. The same pride that pushed me out was now tearing them apart. The same demand for control that silenced me was now suffocating her. And though part of me still longed to rush in, to protect her as I always had, another part of me knew I could not. She had chosen this path, chosen his side, chosen to shut the door on me. All I could do now was watch from a distance as the consequences unfolded. One Sunday after church, an older gentleman who lived near my daughter stopped to speak with me quietly. "I don't want to meddle," he said, "but it's getting bad over there. Yelling late at night. Slamming doors. Folks are worried." I thanked him politely, but inside I felt a storm of emotions, grief, pity, even a trace of vindication I wished I didn't feel. I had warned her in my own way, through my silence, through my refusal to play the role they cast me in. And now, life itself was teaching her the lesson she refused to hear from me. Margaret watched me carefully those days. She never judged, but she understood the complicated knot of emotions twisting inside me. One evening, she set a cup of tea in front of me and said gently, "Sometimes the seeds we plant in arrogance grow into weeds that choke us. All you can do is let her tend her own garden now." Her words settled into me. I sipped the tea slowly, the warmth steadying me. She was right. My daughter had made her choice, and now she had to live with the fruit of it. Still, deep in my heart, the mother in me grieved. Because no matter how wrong she had been, no matter how cruel her words had felt, she was still my child. And watching her stumble in the very shadows she had chosen felt like carrying a stone that grew heavier with each passing day. I began to sense something else too, that this was not the end of the unraveling. Trouble had only just begun knocking at their door. What came next, I could only imagine. But a voice inside me whispered that the storm was far from over. It started one quiet morning. I had just finished making myself a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, and a small cup of coffee. The sunlight spilled through Margaret's kitchen window, gentle and warm, and for once my mind was calm. I reached for my phone to check the time, and that's when I saw it. 3 missed calls. All from the same number. My daughter's. For a long moment I just stared at the screen, my fork frozen in midair. The sight of her name brought a rush of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Shock, anger, sorrow, and something else I couldn't quite name. My heart raced, my breath quickened. After everything she had said, after the way she had looked at me with such coldness, now she was calling? I set the phone down and tried to return to my breakfast, but the calls lingered in my mind like a drumbeat. What did she want? Was it desperation? An apology? Or was it just another demand wrapped in different words? By the afternoon there were 5 more missed calls. No voicemail, no message, just the same repeated attempt. My fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to answer, tempted to hear her voice if only to know what could drive her to call me so persistently. But then I remembered the way her lips had tightened when she gave me the ultimatum, the way she had chosen her husband's pride over my dignity, and I whispered to myself, she gave me silence then. Perhaps it is time she understands what silence feels like in return. Still, it was not an easy decision. A mother's heart doesn't harden overnight. Part of me longed to pick up, to hear if she was safe, to know if the rumors about her crumbling marriage were true. Another part of me, the part that had rebuilt itself in Margaret's home, knew I had to be careful. If I rushed back too soon, I might be dragged into the same cycle of hurt, the same trap of giving everything while receiving nothing. That night I placed the phone on my nightstand and lay awake, staring into the darkness. The screen lit up once more, her name glowing against the shadows, and I turned it face down. My chest ached with the weight of it. To ignore her felt unnatural, but to answer felt dangerous. I asked myself over and over, should I answer? Or should I let her taste the silence she gave me? If you're watching this video right now, stop for a moment, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This story is reaching people across the world, and your support helps me keep telling these powerful true stories. The silence between my daughter and me stretched into days. Each morning I would check my phone and see new missed calls, her name flashing like an echo of a wound I hadn't yet healed. But then the whispers began to reach me, first through Margaret, then through other women from church who had heard it in the market, the way gossip travels like smoke before a fire. They said my daughter's husband was seen in places no married man should be. A restaurant on the far side of town, his hand brushing against another woman's. A hotel lobby late at night, his laughter too free, too careless, as though he had nothing to lose. Some said he had been spending money recklessly, that debts were piling up like stones in a river. Creditors knocking at the door, notices left in the mailbox, his pride forcing him to keep the truth hidden. At first I wanted to dismiss it as idle talk. But when I saw the messages that had trickled into my phone, the unanswered calls now replaced with a desperate text, "Mom, please, I need you," I knew the whispers carried weight. The cracks in her marriage were no longer rumors, they were fractures wide enough for the whole world to see. I sat in Margaret's living room that evening, holding the phone in my hands. My daughter, the same one who told me to serve her husband or leave her home, was now tasting betrayal in her own house. My heart twisted with conflicting emotions. I wanted to reach for her, to hold her the way I did when she was a child, to tell her that storms could pass. But there was another part of me, quieter, but stronger, that reminded me, she chose him over me. She pushed me out into the cold. Now she knows what it feels like to be discarded. I thought back to the night she had looked at me with fire in her eyes, telling me I was no longer welcome unless I bowed to her husband's will. And now, that very man had bowed himself to temptation, to selfishness, to ruin. The irony was sharp, almost cruel. Her betrayal had been mirrored in her own home. The calls came more often after that. Morning, noon, and deep into the night. I didn't answer. Instead, I listened to the silence of my own breathing, the steady rhythm of a woman who had finally learned the value of dignity. Each missed call was a reminder that choices carry consequences, and sometimes the only way to teach that truth is not with words, but with absence. I pictured her sitting in her kitchen, phone clutched in trembling hands, tears running down her face, her world collapsing around her. I could imagine her desperation, the very desperation she had once forced upon me when she demanded that I choose between self-respect and her roof. The cycle had turned. She was the one now abandoned, questioning her worth, searching for someone to lean on. And the only person who could understand her pain, the only person who might forgive her, was the same mother she had cast aside. And I thought to myself, life has a way of circling back. Sometimes the lessons we refuse to learn gently are forced upon us harshly, and sometimes the silence of a mother is louder than her words could ever be. That day the storm arrived in full force. My phone lay on the small wooden table by my bed, buzzing over and over again until it felt like the sound had become part of the walls themselves. 37 times. 37 missed calls, all from my daughter. The number glared back at me as though it wanted to accuse me of cruelty. But I sat still, my hands folded on my lap, my chest rising and falling with a strange rhythm I hadn't known before. Part sorrow, part quiet strength. Each vibration reminded me of nights long ago when she was a little girl and would wake from nightmares, calling my name in the dark. Back then I would rush to her side, hold her close, stroke her hair until her trembling stopped. Now she was calling again, but this time her voice was not reaching me. This time I sat still, watching the phone light up and go dark again, my hands refusing to move. I cannot lie. The sound of her desperation shook me. I am her mother, after all. The instinct to rescue her, to shield her from the world, has never truly died in me. But behind that instinct another voice rose, a steadier, sterner voice. Where was she when you sat alone in your room, humiliated by her husband's words? Where was she when you swallowed your pride in tears, only to be told you must serve or leave? Where was she when you walked away with nothing but your suitcase? That voice kept me anchored to my chair. I did not pick up the phone. I let the silence answer her for me. And in that silence, I felt something I had never tasted before. A bittersweet satisfaction. Not the loud satisfaction of revenge. Not the cruel satisfaction of watching another fall, but the quiet kind, the kind that comes from knowing the scales of life had shifted, that the pain I once carried had found its way back to its sender. The trembling in my hands betrayed me though. I wasn't made of stone. I looked at the screen at her name glowing bright against the dark, and I whispered to myself, my child. My foolish, stubborn child. Tears filled my eyes, but I did not move. I could not move. Because I knew this moment was more than just about her husband's betrayal. It was about choices. About the words she had spoken to me that cut so deeply I felt them long after I left her house. This storm she faced was not just about infidelity or debt. It was about respect. About the bond between mother and daughter that she herself had severed with her own hands. The 37th call rang out longer than the rest, as though she were holding the phone tighter, begging me silently to hear her. But I sat in my chair, the hum of the fan above me mixing with the endless ringing, and I whispered once more, if my love is only welcome when you're broken, then perhaps it is not love you sought but convenience. When the call ended, the silence in the room was heavier than any storm outside, yet deep within me I felt a strange calm settle, like the eye of a storm. I had not spoken a single word, and yet my silence was the loudest answer I had ever given. I was in the kitchen that afternoon, stirring a pot of soup on the stove when I heard the knock. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't patient. It was urgent, hurried, almost frantic. My hands froze on the wooden spoon, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. Then it came again, louder, as though whoever was outside was pounding not just on the door, but on my chest. When I opened it, there she was, my daughter. Her hair disheveled, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She looked nothing like the proud, confident woman who once stood so firmly by her husband's side. No jewelry glittered on her neck, no smile played on her lips. She looked younger somehow, almost like the girl I used to hold in my arms when life frightened her. But this time it wasn't a thunderstorm or a bad dream chasing her. It was her own choices. She threw her arms around me before I could even speak, sobbing into my shoulder. Mom, please. I didn't know who else to come to. I need you. Her voice cracked under the weight of desperation. I stood still, my arms hanging by my side, not pushing her away, but not pulling her close either. My heart was at war. Every instinct in me wanted to cradle her, to tell her it would be all right, to wipe away her tears the way I had done 1,000 times before. But another part of me, the part that had been bruised and abandoned, whispered firmly, not this time. She needs to feel the weight of what she has done. She pulled back slightly, her face trembling as she searched mine. Mom, he betrayed me. He lied, he cheated, he drained our savings. I thought standing by him made me strong. But he left me with nothing. Nothing, Mom. And now I see what I did to you. Her words spilled out like a confession she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was broken but not beyond repair. Still, I would not let my love be mistaken for blind servitude. I took a deep breath and finally spoke. My voice was steady, calm but firm. Daughter, love does not mean servitude. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. When you asked me to serve your husband or leave your home, you chose pride over love, control over compassion. And now you are here asking me to pick up the pieces. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled, and she began to cry harder. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't see it then. I thought I was protecting my marriage. I thought I was being loyal. But I betrayed the one person who never left my side. Please forgive me. I reached out and placed my hand on hers, not tightly, just enough to remind her that I was still here, but on my terms. Forgiveness does not erase what has been done. Forgiveness is not permission to wound me again. If you truly want me in your life, it won't be because you need me to clean up after your husband's sins. It will be because you see me, respect me, and honor me as your mother. The silence that followed was heavier than her sobs. She nodded slowly, as though my words had finally pierced through the fog that had blinded her for so long. I did not embrace her, not fully. I did not rush to soothe her pain. Instead, I gave her the truth, and that was far more powerful than any comfort. Because sometimes love is not in holding, but in teaching. And in that moment, I realized I had not only found my voice again, I had found my strength. If you're still here watching, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your engagement means I can keep sharing stories of strong women who choose dignity, even in the face of betrayal. I looked at my daughter standing in front of me, tears streaming down her face, words tumbling out in fragments of apology and regret. Her hands trembled as though reaching for something she could not quite grasp. My embrace, my forgiveness, my comfort. But I remained steady. I had no anger to throw back at her, no loud words to unleash. My heart had already walked through fire. What remained now was calm, unshakable dignity. I did not gloat at her brokenness. I did not find joy in her downfall, even though a part of me once thought I might. No, what I felt was something quieter, something harder to explain. It was the kind of stillness that comes when you've cried every tear, when you've screamed in silence enough times that your voice no longer trembles. She begged me again, her voice cracking. Mom, please. I know I hurt you, but I can't do this alone. I need you. Please don't turn your back on me. I met her eyes. They reminded me of the little girl who once clung to me on the first day of school, afraid to walk into the classroom. The little girl who used to slip her hand into mine during church when the choir sang too loudly. The little girl who once whispered, "I love you, Mom," as if it were her greatest secret. That child was still in there somewhere, buried beneath pride, mistakes, and choices that had wounded us both. But the woman before me was learning, too late perhaps, that betrayal carries a weight that cannot simply be brushed aside with tears. I placed my hand gently on her shoulder. My touch was not rejection, but it was not full acceptance either. It was a reminder that love is still here, but it no longer comes unconditionally. It must now be treated with reverence. I spoke softly but firmly, the way I once did when teaching her the hardest lessons of childhood. Daughter, I will not shout at you. I will not curse you. But I will also not forget what has been done. You cast me aside when I needed your kindness most. You made my love feel small. And now you know what it is to be discarded, to be left standing in the cold. This is not punishment from me. It is life showing you what you chose to ignore. Her sobs grew heavier, but I did not waver. I took a small step back, not to reject her, but to show her the space she had created with her own decisions. I wish you healing, I whispered. I wish you wisdom. And I wish you strength to rebuild yourself. But you will rebuild without me holding every brick. I have carried too much for too long. Now you must carry your own. The words hung in the air, and in her silence, I saw understanding slowly dawn. Perhaps it was not the answer she wanted, but it was the truth she needed. I turned and walked away, not in anger, not in haste, but in peace. My footsteps felt lighter than they had in years. She called after me once more, her voice trembling with both desperation and realization, but I did not turn around. I kept walking, my head held high, my heart steady, because I knew something she did not yet fully grasp. That sometimes love does not rescue. Sometimes love teaches. And sometimes the loudest revenge is silence. And silence was all I had left to give. When the door closed behind me that day, when the echo of my own footsteps faded into the distance, I felt something I had not known in years, peace. It wasn't loud, it wasn't triumphant, it wasn't even sweet. It was quiet. It was steady. It was mine. For the first time, I realized I had not lost anything when I walked away from my daughter's house. What I left behind was not love, because love does not demand servitude. What I left behind was not family, because family does not force you to choose between dignity and belonging. What I left behind was a weight I had carried too long, convincing myself that endurance was the same as strength. I had spent my life as a mother giving, sacrificing, pouring myself out until I was empty. And for a time, I believed that was what motherhood required. But motherhood is not meant to erase the woman inside. It is not meant to strip away her worth, her voice, her dignity. Yes, mothers give. Yes, mothers endure. But mothers too are human. And humans deserve respect. That day, as I reflected, I thought of every mother, every woman, every person who has ever been told they are too much or not enough, who has ever been asked to bow their head just to be allowed to stay. And I whispered a truth into the quiet of my room. Never let anyone, child, spouse, or stranger, reduce your worth. Sometimes the hardest, most painful choice is to walk away. But walking away does not mean defeat. Walking away does not mean weakness. Sometimes walking away is the strongest thing you can do, because it means you refuse to let love be twisted into chains. I still love my daughter. I always will. Nothing can sever that truth. But love without respect is only pain disguised as devotion. And I will not live my remaining years in pain. I will live them in dignity. So to you listening now, whether you are a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, or simply someone who has ever been broken by those you trusted, I say this: hold on to your worth. Stand tall in your silence when words are no longer enough. And know that sometimes the greatest revenge is not in anger, not in shouting, not in striking back. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is in refusing to bend again. And when the world tries to tell you that you are small, remember, your silence, your walk, your dignity can shake mountains. If this story touched you, give this video a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I truly want to know how far these stories are traveling. Because somewhere out there, another woman needs to hear that she is not alone. And maybe, just maybe, your voice will help carry that truth to her. And with that, the story ends not with anger, not with bitterness, but with strength. For sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else. And silence is enough.